Once upon a time in the shadow of the Bronx, a love story began. Its early chapters echoed promises of timeless passion, devotion, and dreams of a better life. But not all love stories end in happily ever after. Some of them twist under the weight of jealousy, obsession, and rage. This one ended in mass murder. In fact, it was the largest mass murder in U.S. history at the time until the Oklahoma City bombing eclipsed it. On a cold March night in 1990, obsession and rejection crushed a man's heart, and emerging from his emotional wreckage, there was a spark, an impulse, a plan for revenge. With a found bottle and $1 worth of gasoline, his grief coaxed him along a deadly path of catastrophic decisions. A path that would lead him to the door of an illegal nightclub. His fury would bathe the patron's escape route in gasoline. He transformed a lover's fixation into a felonious flame that would trap 87 people within a single man's vengeful penitentiary of fire. However, this is not just the story of a scorned lover. This is a story of systemic failures that devastated an entire community. It's a story that reveals not just the dark places inside the human heart, but the duplicitous nature of a system that identifies but then ignores the dangers threatening its own citizens. From the ashes of the Happy Land Social Club, we bring you a story about the night the music stopped and the fire began. This is a fire that claimed 87 lives as tribute for one man's broken heart. This is Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I've got a backpack full of chill and an alibi.
Please be sure to follow us on X, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. And anytime you see content from us, please give it a like, share it to your network, send it to your friends, leave us a comment. All of these things help ensure our content gets viewed by more people, making it possible for us to find our audience. Each episode requires a huge time commitment and a huge effort to research, record, and produce. And so if you would please help us grow, that is the best support you can give us. Other ways to help us grow include leaving 5-star ratings and written reviews wherever you listen. If your listening platform allows you to leave individual episode comments, that's another great way to engage with our content, which these apps do consider when they decide what content to push out to new listeners. And thank you to the one person that left us an Apple review this week, Paper Swimmer. If you'd like a sticker, email me at crimetoburn@gmail.com and I'll email you one for making the effort. The rest of you are also welcome to email us and share your fire stories, your case suggestions, and to provide feedback. Our email address is crimetoburn@gmail.com. There's also a promotion going on right now in our spread shop where you can buy 3 things and save 10%. I've knocked our prices down so low, spread shop is constantly trying to tell me I need to raise our prices, but we're not trying to make money off of you. We just want you to wear our gear so you can be our walking billboard. The link is in the show notes and on our website.
You gain instantly 10 cool points when you put on a piece of Crime to Burn gear.
Absolutely. Check out our episode with the podcast From Dirt We Grow, and keep an eye out for New Zealand comedian Taylor Ruddle's podcast, Ruddle Me This, because we recorded with him a few weeks ago and that episode should be dropping any day now. If you follow us on social media, I will be sure to let you know when it's out. And someone please tell South Dakota about us. We're still waiting for them to give us a listen so we can brag that we're in all 50 states. I've tried going but apparently they don't respond to feline cues. There's also another way that you can support the show if you are in the market for a dog containment system. As you're all likely well aware, we do have a dog, Winston, and we desperately love Winston, but Winston is high energy and low impulse control.
And he's just one backyard away from a misdemeanor.
And we were desperate to find a containment system to keep him in our yard but allow him to run free to work off some of that hound dog energy. So after several failed attempts to use GPS and satellite collars from other brands, we purchased the Paulius wireless dog fence. No wires, no digging, no drama. It gives him the freedom to run.
Without turning the neighbor's garden into a crime scene.
Just sweet, invisible boundaries. Because Winston doesn't need a rap sheet.
Just a radius.
We've been so happy with the Paulia's system that we contacted them and asked if we could be an affiliate, and they agreed. So if you're looking for a concern-free canine containment contraption to save your sanity, visit www.paulius.com, that's P-A-W-I-O-U-S, and if you use the code CRIME2BURN at checkout, you will get 10% off your purchase. Or you can find the affiliate link in our show notes. For each purchase made using the code CRIME2BURN, we will receive a small commission. But seriously, it's the first system we found that truly works to keep Winston happily hanging at home,
instead of being the neighborhood's hooligan hound.
So zoom me right on over to www.paulius.com and remember to use the code CRIME2BURN at checkout. You can find our sources in the show notes as always. I will warn you that some of the books and articles that I reference conflict with official reports that I found, and details can vary widely, especially between different news reports. So I've done my best to relay the story that aligns most closely with the official reports, so the information presented herein may not fully align with some of the sources listed. Listener discretion is always advised. So let's go back to March 25th, 1990. A Saturday night, a night that for many represents freedom from the responsibilities of day-to-day life. A night when many people collect at bars and clubs pulsing with the anticipation of fun and laughter, and the possibility of romance on the dance floor or tucked away into a dark corner of a cozy bar. Like so many other Saturday nights in the Bronx, the streets were buzzing with the noise of traffic and late-night energy. In the East Tremont section, an area home to a thriving community of immigrants from Central America and the Caribbean, the Happy Land Social Club was the place to be. It was tucked away in an old building. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fancy. In fact, it wasn't legal. It was lacking proper exits, fire alarms, and sprinklers, but it was still a popular community night spot for dancing and libations, where crowded bodies danced to the rhythms of salsa and merengue, moving to the beat with drinks in hands and spirits lifted. But around 3 a.m., the sounds of revelry would change. Outside the club, 36-year-old Julio Gonzalez stood in the cold, his heart broken. His ex-girlfriend, Lydia Feliciano, worked at the Happy Land Social Club. He'd come to the club that night to talk to her, but things went horribly wrong. He'd once whispered promises to her about forever and building a life together in this city of dreams, but their love had soured and she had ended it. And Julio was not taking it well. His attempts to talk to her and convince her to reconsider their breakup soon escalated into a very heated exchange. It got so heated that he was thrown out of the club, and he found himself standing in the cold night, alone, dejected, and enraged. Now, Julio and Lydia were both immigrants trying to establish their footing in New York City. Julio was originally from Cuba and immigrated to the U.S. during the Mariel boat lift in 1980. Now, I feel like this is a super interesting side story and not something that I learned about in history class, so we're going to have a very brief, abbreviated Cuban-American history lesson so we can understand exactly who Julio Gonzalez was and where he was coming from. We don't know a lot about Julio's early life in Cuba, but we do know that he did marry and have a daughter at one point, but was reportedly estranged from them. And we know that at some point he was in prison in Cuba for military desertion, and at least one other time for a drug offense.
Cuba has a military?
They have compulsory military service. In the 60s, the U.S. imposed trade embargoes against Cuba after the Cuban Revolution, and as a result, their economy just absolutely bottomed out, and by 1980, even those Cubans that had initially supported the revolution lost their faith in Fidel Castro and his government, because abject poverty will do that. So people wanted to escape and live literally anywhere else. Since Cuba is an island, their only options were limited to sneaking out on a boat or trying to seek asylum through the foreign embassies located in Havana. However, in a communist country, seeking asylum through a foreign embassy is considered traitorous activity, and you can be charged with treason and sent to prison. The Cuban Revolutionary Police guarded the embassies in Havana, so trying to get into them to seek asylum meant risking arrest, and Cuban prisons aren't exactly known for their stellar treatment of prisoners. So, a group of Cubans stole a bus and crashed it into the embassy of Venezuela in order to get in and get past police. I'm assuming this is where the plotline for the movie Speed came from. Maybe. Probably not. But this plan worked so well that another group tried the same stunt the next year at the Peruvian embassy. Only this time the police fired on the bus, and one of their rounds ricocheted and killed one of the Cuban officers. So Castro demanded that Peru turn over the Cuban embassy storming bus passengers, along with whatever their version of Keanu Reeves or Sandra Bullock, I'm not sure who was driving, to stand trial for the murder of the officer. Peru refused, so Castro threw a temper tantrum that probably rivaled any overtired and overstimulated toddler, and said that if Peru refused, then he was going to pull all the police forces that guarded the embassies. Peru did not flinch. And now Castro has removed the biggest deterrent to Cubans seeking asylum at embassies. So immediately, something around 10,000 Cubans flooded to Havana to get into these embassies to try to escape Cuba. They were trying to make asylum claims, and all of this really chapped Castro's ass.
This episode's been brought to you by Ass Chapstick, made in Cuba.
But instead of putting the police back, he said, "Fine, you don't want Cuba? Cuba doesn't want you. Call your relatives and your friends in other countries and have them motor their boats on over here and pick you up at the port of Mariel, and you can go. Anyone who can essentially get a boat ride out of here can go." Now, the port of Mariel is 80 miles from the United States, so boats began flooding to Cuba from the United States as well as from other islands in the Caribbean. But there was another motive for Castro's sudden change of heart. Castro, always the strategist, saw this as an opportunity to purge his country of people that he deemed problematic or undesirable. So he emptied all the prisons, all the mental hospitals, rounded up all the homeless people and the accused homosexuals, and sent them to the port of Mariel. And when these boats showed up to get their friends and family members, they were also forced to take whoever else the guards ordered them to take, or leave without their family. Some of these boats were so overloaded that they capsized. Now, this was during the administration of Jimmy Carter in the United States, and his administration said that they would not turn away any of the refugees from the boat lift. He said they would welcome them, and they prepared for an influx of about 3,500 Cubans. But over the next 5 months, somewhere between 120 and 125,000 Cubans arrived, and this included Cuba's prisoners, criminals, homeless people, mentally ill people, etc., etc. In the U.S., news that Castro had emptied his prisons and asylums into the U.S. was not well received. In fact, one newspaper said that Castro had flushed Cuba's toilets onto the shores of the United States. And so these people arrived in the U.S. to cities that had nowhere near enough resources to deal with them, and a citizenry that was already prejudiced against them. The government was scrambling, and so they bused many of these new immigrants to other places where they could convert unused government buildings into hasty dormitories, while they rushed to try to process all of these new people. So Julio was sent to one of these centers in Minnesota, which must have been a shock coming from Cuba, expecting to go to Miami, and then being processed through Arkansas and then Minnesota. And he was sent to live eventually with a sponsor family in New York. So all that is to say that Julio's life story wasn't an easy one. He didn't have much in the way of stability, probably ever in his life, and it may help explain why this breakup with his girlfriend was so devastating. It doesn't excuse his actions, but it may help us understand why he was so devastated.
To some people, breaking up with their girlfriend is the end of the world.
And it may have been like that for him too. Plus, imagine never having stability and being like, coming to a new country and being just bounced around. Like, he started in Florida and then went to Arkansas and then Minnesota and then was sent to New York, and like he didn't have any control over any of this.
That would be confusing,
right?
But, yeah, like what dimension are you in today?
And he doesn't speak English. So Julio gets all settled in New York, and he meets an immigrant from Honduras named Lydia Feliciano. Now, their relationship apparently started out super fast, hot and heavy. Descriptions from the people close to the couple indicated that they were always an odd match. Feliciano was outgoing, she was a mother to 3 children from a previous relationship, and she liked to party. Where Julio was more reserved, more of a homebody. So, since Feliciano worked nights at the Happy Land Social Club in the coat room, most nights Julio stayed home taking care of her kids.
So, like, she was, you said, in the coat room?
She's
in a room with coats?
She worked at the coat check.
She's hanging up your coat.
Taking tickets. They said she was a ticket taker and was working in the coat room. But Julio was a very jealous man. Now, they'd been together for 6 or 7 years living together, and their relationship started to erode when he began constantly suspecting her of being unfaithful or accusing her of being out flirting with men all night while he was home with her children. And Feliciano finally had enough and broke it off, and most sources suggest that their breakup was absolutely over Julio's jealousy. But everyone close to them agreed that the breakup was absolutely devastating to Julio.
Of course it was.
Now, when they broke up, Feliciano kicked Julio out, and he moved into a rooming house where he rented an 8-foot by 10-foot room that had no private bathroom. The rent was only $70 a week, and at the same time, apparently, he lost his job at a nearby factory.
Oh.
Yeah. He'd been living with his girlfriend for 6 or 7 years, so he lost his home. His girlfriend, he took care of her kids, so I'm assuming this was operating as a family unit. He lost his family. You don't just
take care of somebody's kids for a minute and then stop taking care of them and then not think about them. That's
exactly. He had left his home country for a country where he didn't even speak English very well, so he had trouble communicating with people. He's lost his job, and so basically this whole thing has put him on the verge of losing his mind.
Obviously.
So that night, Julio goes to the club where he knows Feliciano works. He has a few drinks at the bar to work up his courage, and then he goes to try to talk to Feliciano and convince her to reconsider their breakup.
Doesn't that name sound masculine when you put the O on the end?
That's her last name, Feliciano.
Oh.
Her first name's Lydia.
Oh.
Now this talk escalates into a big fight. So big that the club's bouncer kicks Julio out.
Like what happened?
He's trying to convince her to come back, and
he's just raising his voice, or...
Yeah, they got into basically like a screaming match.
Oh, yeah.
So, as he's leaving, Gonzalez is heard by several people yelling back threats like, "This is the last night you'll work here, and I'm gonna shut this place down," and perhaps the most ominous, "It's you and me until death."
Okay, so he said the "you and me till death" to the girl,
mm-hmm.
and he said the other part to the bouncer.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
So as Julio turned away from the club after being so unceremoniously ejected, his heartbreak and humiliation blossomed into rage. Now, he was furious at being ejected from the club, scorned by the woman he loved, and basically, since he'd lost his job and his family and everything, he now has nothing left to lose.
He has it.
There are a few things more dangerous than a man that feels that he has nothing left to lose. He didn't just want to hurt Lydia Feliciano, he saw the club as the world that she was choosing over him, and for that, he decided it had to be destroyed. So Julio picked up an empty bottle from the street. It was trash to everyone else that had passed it that night on their way to the Happy Land Social Club. But to Julio, this empty bottle held potential. The potential to provide an outlet to his rage, to salve his aching soul with violence. So Julio took that bottle to a nearby gas station where he purchased $1 worth of gasoline, which he dispensed into the bottle. Now, you're not allowed to dispense gasoline into any old random container at a gas station, so the clerk did try to stop him, but Julio gave him a sob story about his car being broken down a couple of blocks away, and so the clerk gave in and allowed him to keep his bottle of gasoline. So this is where he definitely had time to rethink his actions when the clerk confronted him about this, but he didn't. He walked back to the club, the illegally run building with a single exit, and Julio did the unthinkable. He doused the entryway of the club with gasoline, unseen by the patrons, because the entryway was basically a small hallway. At one end was a steel door that was the inner side of the hallway, and it was closed against the chilly night air of the March evening. And the other side of the entryway had a metal security gate, which was open because the club was open. And he arrived, he poured the volatile liquid all down the walls and across the floor, and then he flicked 2 matches into the entryway. Flames erupted like the power opening of a symphonic performance, sudden and daring and blaring intent. And as the flames grew, Julio walked away. He just walked away. Inside the club, the thrum of music and the din of revelry would soon be transformed into a horror house cacophony directed by a conductor that had abandoned his performers to finish the tragic symphony in his absence. Julio went home before the curtain fell, before the end. Before 87 lives had been sacrificed to his enraged and broken heart. And as the patrons of the Happy Land Social Club fell, Julio fell into his own bed. But he was safe. His victims were already gone, erased forever, inside the club that wasn't even supposed to exist.
That's cold. He went to sleep.
In fact, the city had officially shut the club down in 1988, 2 years before the fire. And it had closed briefly, but then it reopened, discreetly, having corrected none of the deficiencies that had resulted in its initial closure. Reopening illegally meant it wasn't an official club, it wasn't on the city's list of places to inspect. City inspectors never revisited it again after that 1988 closure. And the fire inspectors had no latitude to actually arrest people for failing to comply with the orders they issued. So they would refer them to the police, and the police were like, this is a fire department issue, not a criminal issue. So it was a case of somebody recognized that the place needed to be closed, but apparently no one had the authority or the teeth to actually make the owners close it. And the landlord is interesting. The building was owned by a man named Alex DiLorenzo III. Now, he had inherited a huge real estate empire in New York from his father, Alex DiLorenzo Jr. And Alex DiLorenzo Jr. truly had a real estate empire. He owned buildings all along Fifth Avenue, apartment buildings that overlook Central Park. He even owned the Chrysler Building. And when he died, his son took over his empire and drove it into a truly baffling direction, choosing to diversify their real estate empire into purchasing middle and low-income real estate investments. And as a result, many accused him of becoming a slumlord. Imagine going from owning the Chrysler Building to being labeled a slumlord. That's an interesting business strategy. Then DiLorenzo leased the building to a business called Little Peach Realty, which was owned by Jay Weiss and Morris Jaffe. Now, interestingly, Jay Weiss is the husband of famous actress Kathleen Turner. Little Peach Realty had leased the building to club owners Elias Colin and his wife, and they had actually been attempting to evict Colin from the property for months. But he refused to vacate, and so they were having to take him to court. Now, reportedly, it took forever to get a court date because apparently Elias Colin was a master at avoiding being served, and it took many attempts to finally serve him, but they did. And the tragic fact is that the hearing to evict him from the premises was scheduled for March 28th, 3 days after the fire. And this building was not originally constructed as a nightclub. It was originally a one-story retail establishment. It was located at 1959 Southern Boulevard, and the building had been built back in the 1920s. Now, it was roughly 50 feet by 20 feet. So imagine a rectangle that the skinny side of the rectangle is on the street front. So the building's much deeper than it is wide. And it was originally a single story, but at some point someone had added an illegal second story that was not permitted. It was reported that the second story was added while it was still a retail establishment, and that they used the second story originally for storage, so it had very low ceilings. The ceilings on the second floor were only 7 feet. When it became a club, the second story is where the bar, DJ booth, and dance floor were located, so since it only had 7-foot ceilings, I imagine they didn't entertain many NBA players.
Shack not there.
Now,
or has back pain.
Most sources that you'll read will say that the building was not sprinklered, and it wasn't fully sprinklered. But according to NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they did a post-fire hazard analysis, and the building did have some sprinklers. Baffling sprinklers. They had a single row of sprinklers down one side of the second floor, which makes zero sense, and I cannot figure out exactly what the protection intent might have been, and NIST did not seem to hazard a guess either. My best guess is that it was maybe sprinkler protected before it was a club, and perhaps maybe there was a wall there that now no longer exists, and this room was deemed some sort of higher hazard and therefore needed sprinkler protection. Honestly, it's impossible to say. Now, they didn't have a fire alarm system. They were operating a nightclub without an assembly permit. They didn't have enough fire extinguishers. They had one in the whole building. They didn't have any emergency lights or exit signs. They didn't even have a liquor license. In fact, even if they had one, they were serving kids. Apparently, if you could pay the cover, you could drink at Happy Land, and the youngest victim that night was only 14 years old. Now, the club had one stair for patrons to use as an exit from the second floor. And in one news article I read, someone described it as a, quote, rickety wooden stair. If you're ever in a nightclub and you would describe the stair as rickety and wooden, get out. But this stair truly was scary, even if the description of rickety was overblown. It was in the far rear corner of the building behind the downstairs bar, and at the top of the stair it turned 90 degrees, which created a pinch point that was only 19 inches wide. And this was the only stair patrons had access to.
That's the configuration.
And it's made out of wood. Nice and flammable.
Best things are.
There was a second stair closer to the front of the building, but it led into the service entrance downstairs, so this stair was gated off with security gates because obviously the club owners didn't want the patrons down in the service entrance area. And I won't bore you with calculations, but when I figured it out, the available stair width was less than 1/3 of what would have been required by code. In addition, the minimum number of exits would have been at least 2 from each story. But there was one from the upstairs, that rickety stair, and downstairs there was the front door and the service entrance, which was also facing the front of the building, 10 feet away from the front door. Now by code, this translates to counting as a single exit, because when you have to have more than one exit, they have to be located remotely from each other because of the risk that a single fire could eliminate both exits if they're close together like this. But there was no rear exit, just the 2 doors out of the front of the building, 10 feet apart. So the main entrance had that steel interior door, a little wooden entryway, and then a steel roll-down gate. And when Gonzalez lit the fire, he pulled that steel roll-down gate closed behind him. Now, when firefighters arrived at the club just minutes after the initial alarm, some reports say 3 minutes, some reports say 6 minutes, they described that the scene was all wrong. There was a fully involved building, dozens of people reportedly trapped, yet they could hear no screams. No voices raised above the roar of the fire, just the silence of injustice and tragedy. Firefighters extinguished the fire and revealed an absolutely gruesome scene inside. There were 87 victims, and 68 of them were on the second floor. It was determined that all 68 victims on the second floor had died of smoke inhalation. This wasn't just a fire, this was a massacre. A massacre born from obsession, fueled by heartbreak, and enabled by a system that looked the other way. This was a single act of revenge that left a scar forever on the community. By the time the smoke cleared and officials began moving the bodies, Julio Gonzalez was asleep in his bed. Now, one source says that Julio actually got home and at first woke up one of his neighbors in the boarding house and told them that he'd set a fire, but he was drunk and the neighbor thought he was just talking nonsense and was too drunk and sent him to bed. So as the police began questioning bystanders, that's when they learned that earlier in the evening there had been a fight between Lydia Feliciano and Julio Gonzalez. Now we know for sure there were 5 survivors of the fire, and there may have been more. But recall that this was a largely immigrant community, and for those people in the community that might have been here illegally, cooperating with authorities would have been risky. So it's likely there was more than 5 survivors, but we only know of 5 for sure. But one of the survivors was none other than Lydia Feliciano, the one person that Julio Gonzalez had intended to destroy, the object of his ire. And one of the other 5 survivors was the bouncer that had ejected Gonzalez from the club that night. But Lydia Feliciano would do something unexpected when she escaped the building. She didn't stay. She didn't call the fire department. She ran. She ran from the scene. Now, some reports say she ran home or to a relative's house, and some say she actually stopped and called a cab. And for many of the family members of the victims, Feliciano's running away was an indictment of her character. They didn't see it as a product of her fear at the realization that the fire could have been targeting her, and that her perpetrator, her own ex-boyfriend that she knew was obsessed with her, might have been waiting outside to do violence to her as he had threatened to earlier that night. Lydia Feliciano was scared, so she ran. Now, another survivor was Irma Colon. This was the wife of the club's owner and operator. Her husband died in the fire, but Irma was with Feliciano when the fire broke out and the two escaped together. Her husband Elias, the club's owner, was found inside the club holding the only fire extinguisher, but he'd never even had a chance to pull the pin. In the days following the fire, Irma Colon received an absolute outpouring of community support. But Lydia Feliciano was demonized, and this is baffling to me because Lydia was an intended victim and she had done nothing wrong. But Colon, she and her husband, operated this death trap. And I don't for one second believe that she wasn't fully aware that they were illegally operating the club, nor do I believe that she was unaware that they were supposed to be closed for fire safety violations. But the people in the community blamed Feliciano and embraced Irma Colon. So police showed up at Feliciano's apartment to question her about the fire, and Lydia told them everything. She told them about the breakup, about Julio's temper and his threats, his obsession. She told them about the argument that night and about the things that he had said when he left. And she told them that she suspected Julio Gonzalez could have done this. So around noon, the day after the fire, the police arrived at Gonzalez's boarding house and found him still asleep in bed. His clothing and shoes reeked of gasoline. And once they were able to wake him up, he sat on his twin bed below the picture of Jesus that hung on his wall and told the police that yes, he had set the fire and he didn't know why he'd done it, but he guessed the devil got into him.
Right up his butthole.
Now, Gonzalez went to trial in 1991, represented by the ironically named attorney Richard Byrne. He faced 178 counts, including 2 murder charges for each victim, one for felony murder and one for acting with depraved disregard for human life. He also faced charges of arson and assault. Now, he pled guilty by reason of insanity, but the state argued that he wasn't insane because he'd had the wherewithal to lie to the gas station attendant about his car running out of gas, and this illustrated that he'd act with forethought and malicious intent. Now, the trial lasted 6 weeks, and some reports say the jury needed 4 days to deliberate, but I saw others that said it only took them hours. I'm not sure which is accurate. But they decided that Julio Gonzalez was not insane, and he was found guilty of all 176 charges. Now, he was sentenced to 25 years for each count, but because of New York law at the time, all 25 years for each count had to be served concurrently. So he would be eligible for parole potentially within his lifetime. So 25 years, essentially, for 87 murders. At sentencing, Justice Burton Roberts said, quote, "There are many to be blamed for this fire, not just Julio Gonzalez." On the first anniversary of the fire, a $5 billion lawsuit was filed on behalf of the victims' families. However, the lawsuit was held up because operating an illegal business violated the insurance that the club held and that the landlords held, so the insurance companies claimed that they had no obligation because their clients had been in violation of their policy contract.
I was going to ask, who were they suing exactly?
Or suing. When you file a lawsuit like that, you basically sue anyone that could have possibly had a role. So they would have sued the city for not shutting the club down. They would have sued everyone that owned the building, all the landlords along the way, the people that operated the club, and then as they work through the case, they slowly drop any defendants that they decide aren't.
I guess I didn't realize you could just shotgun sue the world and then narrow it down to a rifle shot.
Then it was found that DiLorenzo was in serious debt with his company, and it was determined that trying to include him in the lawsuit would result in even more years of delay in the legal proceedings, because those lawsuits would have to be settled before he could be included, and they would be needed just to determine which assets would be fair game in the trial. And because the victims had already been waiting for relief so long, he was ultimately dropped from the civil suit just so the suit could proceed. Now, many of these victims' families were undocumented, and they had no record of their family members' income, or they were not legally married, and so providing all the information required to the victims' assistance groups for help was problematic, and so a lot of these families were victimized all over again, just trying to get help or get a piece of this lawsuit, and were ultimately excluded. So it was decided to proceed without DiLorenzo in order to speed up the process, and ultimately the settlement was somewhere in the neighborhood of $15.8 million, which even if all 87 victims' families got a piece of that, that would have been $181,609.20 per victim before the lawyers took their cut.
That's very specific.
$181,000 a piece. That is peanuts for what happened. Both DiLorenzo and Weiss were charged with misdemeanors associated with the fire for their code violations. Weiss pled and had to pay $60,000 and do 50 hours of community service. DiLorenzo was ordered to pay a $150,000 fine and perform 50 hours of community service. Gonzalez was eligible for parole for the first time in 2015 and was denied, and before he could reapply, he died of a heart attack in prison, so he is gone. What happened at the Happy Land Social Club wasn't just the result of one man's rage. It was the outcome of a city that failed its people. They failed to protect, failed to act, failed to enforce, and the cost was paid in the lives of 87 people and in the grief of their families and in the silence that followed. So 35 years later, we remember this tragic event not just to remember the dead, but to hold the living accountable for properly permitting and licensing their establishments and for taking fire protection and life safety seriously. This is Crime to Burn, and for the 87 lives lost that day, we remember you, and we are committed to doing better.
I think a lot of stuff is dumb. She knows when it's arson and when it's just bad cooking. Disgraced inventor of the infinite matchbook. Sparks fly, but mostly lawsuits. Help. I don't think I'm doing well. If you don't cry during that scene at the beginning with Kurt Russell holding the hat, you're just a monster. Oh, that sounds incriminating.
The true crime enthusiast with zero chill and questionable life choices.
I have a lot of chill. That's not even true. I'm being mislabeled.
My bot doesn't know you. My bot barely knows me.
I have a backpack full of chill. This is going to be used against me someday. I just know it. Questionable leadership.
Oh, questionable is putting it lightly.
I don't know. I'll eat almost anything ceviche.
Oh,
they have good beans. That's just my showing for the whole world.
I don't know what any of that means.
You're so wholesome. I mean, you already posted a thing that said you had a podcast.
That was just a typo.
And yet there it is. Crime to Burn podcast. That kind of makes you wonder, what is our real intention?
Not because I'm wholesome.
You're pretty wholesome.
Not intentionally. Just knitted together out of wholesome stuff.
Yeah, like wool and freeze-dried butter.
You can freeze-dry butter.
Butter flakes.
So while you were gone, I had to save a surveyor from our dog. He just came out of the woods onto the road, and he obviously had his survey equipment.
Well, we're used to seeing bears come from there.
Yeah, he did come from exactly with the path that the bears normally come from. So
he's like, what is this bald albino bear?
With a high visibility vest.
Yeah.
I didn't remember her name was Charlotte, though.
Johnson. Middle name is Big.
Charlotte Big Johnson? I don't get it.
Seriously.
I get the Big Johnson part, but Charlotte?
You get the Big Johnson, do you?
Most nights.
I'm a master of the... We can never post that. And I was joking. I consent to this behavior. They say when you're diving to beware of dolphins. I would suggest the dolphins beware of me. You didn't watch professional wrestling, I guess.
No.
That guy really left an impression on my psyche. That was almost traumatizing, but it was a lot of fun to watch. Near trauma.
Trauma adjacent, as you would say.
Was I here for this conversation?
Yep.
You need to get better at taking dictation. Hilarity just ensued.
He transformed a lover's... Blah, blah, blah.
He transformed a lover's... Blah, blah, blah. That's an accomplishment.
He transformed a lover's fixation into a felonious flame.
Nice alliteration, huh? I didn't even know you did that. Because it sounds a little like Bolognius.
He transformed a lover's fixation into...
Let's say some F words to the public.
He transformed a lover's fixation into a felonious flame.
You said that without saying penetration. I'm so proud of you.
It came so close to saying penetration.
I know. I felt like you were edging penetration. I need your consolation prizes. I have not caused spontaneous prolapse. They want to hear the silky, smooth, velvety voice explains anything to you. Oh God, you look like I scarred you. Did you just give me side-eye? My side-eye detector beeped once. Well, I like beer dark enough to chew it. Yeah, but you're a girl. My dear, I wish you were the standard for women. Honestly, you're amazing. Sometimes I just want to walk by and pat your head. It's funny, they all turn the same color when you choke them.
That's, wow.
Well, you gotta have a hobby. I'm like a terrible gully on the side street, southern Arkansas. Way too muddy and too many mosquitoes, and unexpectedly there's a lot of crawdads, but you really don't want to eat them.
A bubble in my throat. A bubble in my throat. I can't get it out. There's a bubble in my throat.
Me neither. I'm not a historian.
I've never gone further back than Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Or a nerd. And that's how we got Chick-fil-A.
I see what you did there.
That's a weird voice you just made. What the
f***
was that? What are you possessed by? Back demon! The power of Christ compels you! Lay it on me, baby. How are you going to order a Big Mac if you only know the metric system? Sounds like a molestery name. Little Peach. I'm descended from disgusting people.
Club owners Elias Colon.
Damn, dude.
Actually been attempting to evict Colon from the property for months.
You know, sometimes not every remedy works the first time.
But he refused to vacate. Damn it!
He's like the extra corn.
Okay. Elias Colon was a master at avoiding being served, and it reportedly...
You can never make that sound before you say colon again.
In a rectangle that's a little longer than it is wide. And this...
That's what all rectangles are. I think every wet t-shirt is beautiful. I wanted to be on your side, but you are just a douche. Julio. I'm at math, evidently. What about Brad in the mailroom? Is he in danger? I'm a failure! Failure! You're thinking of priapism.
No.
The sun never sets on this sundial. It's always high noon on my neighborhood.
So a malaprop.
Oh dear.
Or a malapropism is the mistaken use of a word in place of a similar sounding one, often with unintentionally amusing effects. As in, for example, dance a flamingo instead of dance flamenco.
Maybe, but it sounds like a weird boner. Delicious and nutritious. Full of protein. We just got done talking about this guy named Julio.
But you sound like you said, much like Coolio's mom. I heard...
Why the would I say anything about Coolio's mom? I've never even met her.
Anaphylaxis, when your throaty gets closey. I was a dark child. And that makes me a lucky lady.
Woof. Arf. Bark. I can take direction. You can take dictation, maybe. And he's just one word away from another word. What was it?
Paulius, because Winston doesn't need a rap sheet.
But he already has one. What?
Just a radius.
You're supposed to give me the line before you expect the line when you haven't told it to me. Of your balls. What?
All right, I think we need to end this.
Looking for your next true crime podcast? Then consider checking out my show, Truly Twisted, wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, my name is Alicia Watson, and each Thursday I will be bringing you a twisted story that is always victim-focused and fact-based. My goal is simple, bringing a voice to the voiceless. So be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at It's Truly Twisted. And for more on my show and other amazing creators, visit fireeyesmedia.com. And in the meantime, remember, you are wanted, you are loved, and you deserve to be here. And I'll see you there.
Fire Eyes Media.